Just over a year ago, there was a sequence of 3 different funerals that I had to conduct. 2 of them were for young men in their 20s and one was for a young man in his 30s. But the similar characteristic to these 3 funerals was that they were suicides, and they were mainly as a result of alcohol or drugs misuse over many years. And it was characteristic of what's happening in the community as well, where drugs and alcohol does tend to dominate the lives of the young people. Not a lot of jobs, not a lot of opportunities, not a lot of things that would indicate hope for the future. And so it's very easy for the young people to get drawn into that cycle of things. The first 2 funerals, the 2 young men in their 20s, were funerals where they were not at all expected by families, which is often the case with suicides, but sometimes there's been earlier indications that things are happening. But the second one was actually one of the young people who had held the cord for lowering the coffin for the first young man. So there was a connection between those 2, and the families themselves had some connection. The families themselves had not had any previous contact with the church at all. So it's not even as if they had had early or in their younger days had contact with the church, which meant that there was very little to draw on in terms of their understanding of shaping things with liturgy. They didn't have many resources in terms of understanding that prayers could be a certain way, or that anything could be different to the norm. But having said that, there were a couple of things that we did do, and some of them would be things I think that other people do use at other times as well. So for example, encouraging them to think about having a photograph of the person who had died on the coffin, actually visible at the front so that people could see that. For one of them, they decided to have that in the vestibule of the church, so that as people came in, and to be reminded that the person's life was not defined just by the last few days or the last moments, but there was a whole life there that we were remembering. And in the words used as part of the liturgy, then that was also part of what I tried to emphasise, that even if it was the latter part of that person's life that was uppermost in people's thinking, it was actually the whole life that we were there to remember and to keep that focus. Participation was not going to be strong in terms of the funeral service itself, mainly because it was such an alien environment for them, and they had very firm, fixed ideas about what the hymns should be, even though they didn't know them. I think it was almost like a received expectation that it would be "Abide with me" or "The Old Rugged Cross," and that related to the fact that it was also a previous mining community, and those are the 2 favourites in that. So it was almost like that was their way of plugging it into community knowledge and base of understanding. So there wasn't a lot of room for manoeuvre on that. But one of the things that we did do, in addition to having the photographs and me changing a lot of the wording to emphasise that this was not just about the last few moments of that person's life, but more, was at the graveside, and this is something that I use a lot, was to encourage people to come close. People tended to stand far off, as if it was only the business of the minister and the close mourners to be at the graveside, and everybody else to be an observer. And so encouraging people to come close, not to be scared of these last few moments, and to stand together and use those words to say, come and let's come close, let's stand together and let's be together in these last few moments as we say farewell. So using those kinds of words to emphasise that we are in it together at that moment.
And did people move together?
Yes, yes, they did. Yes.
Yeah.
And then there are some words which are to be found in one of the Iona community resources, but I've used that a lot, and I've found that that's for people who are not used to strong participation in these settings, then it has worked very well. So it's saying, I'm going to say 3 sentences, and after each sentence we all say together, we let you go. And so, for example, the first line is, into the freedom of wind and sunshine, we let you go. And just to give it in a sort of measured way, gives people the chance to catch on to what is happening, you know, into the cycle of living and dying and rising again, we let you go. And after the 3 sentences to say, you know, we love you, we miss you, go safely, go swiftly into God's embrace. And it's almost then at that point it is meant that it's not just the minister that is committing this life into God's hands, but it is everyone. So that was possible, even when there had been no previous contact with church.
It sounds like you feel it's important for the people to participate in some way.
Yes. Yes, if possible, because there is such a numbness that tends to be around in those early days, getting used to the fact that somebody has died. There's frenetic activity in dealing with all the legal requirements, dealing with all the preparations that have to be done, that people don't have the space to really allow a lot of their emotions to come to the fore. It's almost like it's a period of a real cocktail of dishonesty and yet honesty. You know, they want to be truthful to what has happened and about the person, but at the same time everybody's holding everybody else up in a certain way, and they will maybe say some things as well that or be kinder, whereas given a little bit of time they might have wanted to be a little bit more honest about what their relationships were. So the funeral itself is an opportunity to handle that whole mixed bag of emotions in a way that gives people a vehicle to realise that you can carry both that sense of honesty and dishonesty together.
Frequently when a young person dies, there are these shrines that are created on the roadside, or now these maybe didn't happen in that way, but have you had any experience with that?
Yes, what I have found interesting in that particular community was it was almost as if people were creating the shrines in their homes. So for me it was a little bit reminiscent of in some homes where Hinduism has been the faith, where there might be little shrines for different reasons and different purposes. But in all 3 cases, these families, when I went to make the funeral visit before the funeral, in a corner in the room or in the person's own room themselves, certain things were not to be moved, or they had placed things, or they, for one of them, for example, in the kitchen, what had been the family little pin board where shopping lists would have been and so on, it became the pin board where people pinned up little photographs that brothers or sisters collected together, and sort of reminding one another of how they had known this person, you know, or little pieces of ribbon off a gift that somebody had given them at Christmas time or something like that. And so it was almost like these impromptu little family home shrines were emerging and that in itself meant that when I went to do, because in those particular cases making several visits before the funeral because of the nature of the death, meant that I tried to make it so that we were in the place where that was, because it was an opportunity to encourage them to talk about why those things were there, or even just to notice, oh, I see that you've got something else, somebody's put a wee coat up there, you know, who gave you that, or where did that come from? And again, helping them to recognise that the breadth of support that they had was also not just from a single line. There was one, because the suicide had taken place in a park, a public park, and so under the slide where the young man had hung himself, then it was almost like it had created an under the slide shelter in that sense, because there were candles and cards and flowers and mementos placed under the slide where he had died. And I talked with the family about that space, and the parents didn't want to go there, didn't want to go at all, and so I'd asked them if they minded me going there and placing something, and told them that if I were to do that, then I would be thinking about them even if they couldn't come. And was there anything they especially wanted me to place there, even though they found it too hard to go there. And the mother gave me a little card with a flower on it. So I did that. But again, there was like a standing away from the participation, so it's finding what was the possibility of participation, and it seemed to be that it was for me to do something on their behalf. And I'm sure that varies with different families. You see the level of participation that they want, but for them it was almost like they wanted me to do a lot of the things on their behalf.